E.B. White once said, "I would feel more optimistic about a bright future for man if he spent less time proving that he can outwit nature and more time tasting her sweetness and respecting her seniority." For me, this quote introduces a different kind of relationship between humans and nature. And it's a relationship that has really sparked a lot of environmental communication research, including a paper that I recently co-authored with Michael Salvador about using critical rhetoric as an alternative way of analyzing environmental communication messages. In recent years, we've seen some developments with regard to environmental communication. We've had authors like Callister and Edelstad calling for new approaches to environmental communication that place more emphasis on finding and supporting alternative voices. In particular, Edelstad argues that framing analyses severely constrain an environmental communication scholar's ability to challenge dominant representations of nature and bring in those alternative voices. The paper that I've submitted for publication along with my co-author positions critical rhetoric as an alternative to framing. And we argue that one way of discovering alternative perspectives on global warming is to categorize those media messages about it on a continuum. And this continuum looks at the human-nature relationship, and it talks about representations of our connection with the physical world. Three of the discourses that we identified along this continuum are: 1, nature as being out of reach; 2, nature as being an antagonist; and 3, nature as being co-present with humans. When we talk about critical rhetoric, what we're really talking about is an orientation and not a method. And what it focuses on is maximizing what can count as communication. In particular, it takes a lot of care in emphasizing the importance of alternative perspectives. What it looks for is discourse that 1, marginalizes nature, or 2, increases nature's agency and enhances our relationship with nature. For the study that we produced, we looked at New York Times articles and Washington Post articles from January 2009 to June 2010, and we identified these articles using a LexisNexis search of terms like global warming, greenhouse gas, fossil fuel, polar bear, climate change, and carbon emission. We also included LA Times articles from January 2011 through June 2011, and we identified those articles with the keyword search of global warming. To take a look at these different discourses that we identified on this continuum, we can start out by looking at nature as out of reach discourse. And this discourse constructs the largest distance between humans and nature. It does it in 2 ways. The first way is that it places nature as far away. So an example of this would be a quote from an article that says, "Everybody is interested in health, but audiences see climate change as a distant phenomenon that affects parts of the world we don't see." Obviously, the word distant places nature far away. Another way that nature is out of reach discourse is created is by portraying humans as unable to move toward nature. So one article said, "Realistically, the cap and trade bills in the House and Senate are going nowhere." So the human ability to move toward nature through a cap and trade bill that would address global warming is portrayed as not being able to go anywhere. The second type of discourse is nature as an antagonist. And this is interesting because it presents a closer relationship than the nature is out of reach, but it portrays that relationship as a matter of human domination. So while we may have an interaction with nature, that interaction really reinforces traditional understandings of the human-nature relationship. And this nature as antagonist discourse is created in two different ways. One, we see nature presented as an adversary that must be fought. So an example of this actually comes from climate change activist Bill McKibben, and he says, but the danger that comes from climate change is every bit as real and in the long run far greater than anything that Al-Qaeda could throw at us. So what we have here is a presentation of climate change as a threat, something that we need to fight, just like terrorism. Another way of constructing nature as antagonist discourse is to present nature as an object that requires human control. So for example, one of the articles mentions that many climate change scientists and the United Nations Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change have set a goal of stabilizing atmospheric carbon at 450 parts per million. And the word here to focus in on is stabilizing. That mentions the issue of bringing carbon emissions down to 450 parts per million if they exceed that, and to focus in on that number as the key to controlling global warming. So stabilizing puts humans in this manager mode of controlling nature in ways that will mitigate global warming. The third type of discourse that we identify on our continuum is nature as co-present. And this is the closest relationship, and it's the one that provides the most opportunities for introducing alternative voices like the voice of nature. It's constructed in two ways. First, we see communication about global warming between humans and nature. So an example of this would be, birds are excellent indicators of the health of our environment, and right now they are telling us an important story about climate change. So what we have here is birds able to tell stories and communicate with people about this issue of climate change. So you have global warming bringing people together with birds in the storytelling process. Another example would be, I may respond to climate change as by buying a Prius, planting a tree, or lowering my thermostat. And what this example suggests is that people can actually respond to the signals that nature is sending us. So again, we have communication between humans and nature. Another way that nature as co-present discourse is constructed is by presenting a shared experience. So an example here would be from an article that says, a delegation of Washington area students and one squirmy diamondback terrapin named Happy were beamed into Thursday's United Nations Climate Change Conference in Copenhagen to help advance a solution for curbing climate change. So what we have here from this example is not only shared communication about global warming, but the students and the terrapin share that experience. They get to express the impacts of global warming to the Copenhagen conference. And as a result, you have people and nature sharing this experience and sharing the communication about global warming. When we look at these different types of discourse critically, a few things really stand out. One, the nature as out of reach discourse really privileges human interests and ignores nature's ability to contribute a voice to the discussion about global warming. As a result, we see humans having a constrained ability to respond to nature's signals. If nature's voice isn't involved that much, it's harder to be able to engage in a conversation with nature. With regard to the nature as antagonist discourse, this brings nature into the conversation, but it limits the scope of that conversation to military, violent, and control-focused terms that privilege humans over nature. So what you're seeing is the control of something that is already dominated. Humans in traditional discourse about the environment dominate nature, and so this discourse reinforces that control and takes away from nature's power in the process. Now, the nature as co-present discourse is really interesting because it challenges a lot of these dominant discourses. It includes nature as a speaking entity, and that allows us to identify nature as an alternative voice and maybe even champion that voice. And then it provides a very fundamental link between humans and nature. We see that link developing in terms of communication, but we also see it developing in terms of actual experience. So it goes beyond words to this shared experience of global warming. Some of the implications that this has for environmental communication can be fleshed out when we look at contestation of discourses and the ability to bounce these different discourses off of each other, challenging them, and then maybe producing new ideas out of those challenges. So for example, the nature as co-present discourse really challenges nature as out-of-reach discourse because it places nature right there with us in a shared experience or in an act of communication. We can't say that nature and humans are separate in that kind of discourse. And so what we end up getting are new interactions, new portrayals of those interactions, and we can move people closer to nature in that regard. Nature's out-of-reach discourse has some benefits because it reveals new parts of the world. Some parts of nature are far away from our day-to-day experiences. So to include that in a broader conversation, we can actually expand people's understanding if do so by saying that some things in nature are distant, but other things are closer and can be experienced on a day-to-day level. We can also use the nature as co-present discourse to challenge the nature as antagonist discourse, or to amend it. So we can present nature in the form of global warming as being a threat, but instead of talking about it in war terms or in violent terms, we can talk about it maybe as a need for peace. By bringing peace to an unstable situation or a threatening situation, we can maybe produce ideas that benefit both humans and nature. What we really get with the nature as co-present discourse is an opportunity of seeing nature as a proactive communicator and having a right to survive. So we see the interest of nature and the voice of nature included in this discussion, and as a result, we are better able to consider the full scope of global warming and how it impacts not just humans, but the environment as well. Some of the key contributions that our paper makes are, one, providing an alternative to framing. And we see how using critical rhetoric as an alternative allows us to identify the voice of nature and become a champion for the voice of nature, which, as we see from some of the environmental communication research, is a major focus. It provides a way of organizing media discourse. We've got some big texts, a lot of coverage of global warming, but critical rhetoric allows us to take on those big texts and analyze them along this continuum. We can also bring in more of the physical world. We see nature's voice, we see these environmental signals, and now we can respond to them in the context of the larger discourse about global warming. We also have an ability to challenge traditional beliefs about the environment and challenge approaches to analyzing media. What we end up getting overall is an approach that looks toward an enhanced human-nature relationship. We have better exchanges with the environment, we can respond to nature's signals, and we might be able to create solutions and ways of responding to global warming that are mutually beneficial for both humans and nature.